Chapter 1351. Mr. Su didn't want to argue with her, so he picked up his bathrobe and walked into the bathroom. But Mrs. Su obviously didn't want to let him go, so she followed him in. If she were our biological daughter, would you be willing to let her marry a jerk like Qin Anlin? Mr. Su wiped away the moisture on his face, squinted at his wife, and said in a suppressed voice, "Don't you miss her at all?" Mrs. Su's tears flowed down, and she gave Mr. Su a beating, crying as she hit him. "Why don't I miss her? I miss her even in my dreams. But what's the use of thinking about her? She can't be found." Mr. Su let his wife hit him. His eyes narrowed, as if thinking about something. He also felt a little guilty towards his wife. In this life, he had even schemed against his wife. And his daughter, the daughter that he missed dearly. Everything was in his hands, including Su Chung, who was just an insignificant chess piece in his palm. After a long time, Mr. Su finally coaxed Mrs. Su. He had feelings for Mrs. Su. After all, she was his first wife. Moreover, he felt sorry for her, and also for their biological daughter. In the early morning at the hospital, Qin Anlin quietly got up and looked at Yi Liangxiu, who was sleeping soundly. He took away her medicine bottle, which contained birth control pills. He walked over to the nurse on duty at the pharmacy. "Open a bottle of vitamins for me." The nurse looked at him and smiled. "Mr. Qin, you probably haven't prescribed your own medicine, right? The doctors in the hospital prescribe it, but vitamins can be bought at the pharmacy, so there's no need to go through so much trouble." Qin Anlin nodded and asked the nurse to buy similar vitamins for him. The nurse opened his medicine bottle, looked at it, and smiled even more happily. "Mr. Qin, there's no need for that. It's vitamin C, not birth control pills." Qin Anlin couldn't believe it. He looked at the nurse and asked, "Are you sure?" The nurse smiled. "Of course not. I take it every day. It can't be wrong." Qin Anlin clenched the medicine bottle in his hand and didn't say anything. Yi Liangxiu was clearly taking vitamin C. Why did she tell him it was birth control pills? Then, there was only one reason: she wanted to get pregnant. Was she trying to trap him? Is that why you want to have another child? There was an indescribable feeling in Qin Anlin's heart. But what he was sure of was that there was one thing he urgently needed to do right now: divorce Chi-Chi and put an end to this absurdity. When he returned to the ward, he didn't make a sound and put the bottle back. He called Kaim and asked him to send the documents he had prepared to pay Chi-Chi. However, only he and Kaim knew about this matter, because Pei Chi-Chi and Tang Yu would be a good shield. No matter what Mr. Su did, he would not dare to touch Pei Chi-Chi. After hanging up the phone, he sat back on the bed, pinched Yi Liangxiu's face, and said coldly, "Get up and make breakfast." Yi Liangxiu woke up, opened her eyes and looked at him for a while, then covered her head and went back to sleep. "Yi Liangxiu, I said I'm hungry." He lifted the quilt and said shamelessly in her ear, "I fed you last night, so shouldn't you feed me now?" She couldn't stand him, so she finally sat up and glanced at him. "I don't want to do it." He wasn't angry, but smiled lightly. "Then, let me know when you want to do it." Yi Liangxiu was angry, but what could she do to him? Chapter 1352. He knew how to cook? Yi Liangxiu was a little surprised, but he had already gone to the small kitchen. Soon, she could smell the aroma of seafood porridge. She ran over and saw that he was dividing the pot of porridge into small bowls and cooling them. Looking up and seeing her surprised expression, Qin Anlin chuckled. "This is Chi-Chi's favorite food." She leaned against the door and said slowly, "Looks like your culinary skills have improved a lot in the past 2 years." Pausing for a moment, she asked harshly, "Qin Anlin, how is it? How does it feel to be a grandson?" He glanced at her. "I don't really know, but knowing that you're jealous makes me feel good." "I'm not." She sat down and took a sip, but he hit the back of her hand with his chopsticks. "You didn't brush your teeth or wash your face." The back of her hand immediately turned red. She looked up and glared at him. "What are you looking at?" He snorted. "Hurry up and go." Yi Liangxiu mumbled, "Old mama. I'm sure I'm a man. I think you should know better," he said shamelessly. There was a hidden meaning in his words. Yi Liangxiu looked at him and suddenly said, "When Muyan wakes up, we'll go back to City H." With that said, she walked towards the washroom. but she had only taken 2 steps when he caught her hand. That's not what I meant. Qin Anlin's lips tightened. I don't have any feelings for Su Chung, and I won't marry her. You don't have to explain to me. Yi Lianqiu's voice was a little cold. Explain it to Pei Chi-Chi. He smiled and pulled her into his arms with a little force. His thin lips pressed against her ear. Lianqiu, I've already sent the divorce papers. She was stunned, and then she started to struggle. She had an inexplicable fear in her heart, but she didn't know what she was afraid of. Perhaps, from her heart, she did not want to hear his confession. This was not what she wanted. But how could he let her go? He held her in place and said in a hoarse voice, Lianqiu, don't you want to know what I've been through all these years? She shook her head violently. I don't want it at all. You have to know. His voice was a little low as he whispered in her ear, I didn't plan to tell you, but you like to let your imagination run wild. I think if I don't tell you, you will dare to be with other men in H City. If that happens, I will go crazy, Lianqiu. As he spoke, he hugged her tightly. Lianqiu, do you think I'm crazy? She was completely stunned. She stared straight at him with tears in her eyes. I admit that I thought I liked Chi-Chi and that I loved her. His face was buried in her neck, as if he was trying his best to hide something. Lianqiu, when I first saw her, you left me and went missing. That year, no one knew where you were, including Yingjie. At that time, when I saw Chi-Chi, I felt that she was a dazzling new star. But I never thought that the reason why I paid so much attention to her was because she resembled you. He said a lot, more than what he usually said to her. Lianqiu, if it wasn't for you, I think I would have fallen in love with her too. But after I fell in love with you, I fell in love with her only because of the comfort in my heart. This was a kind of replacement. Because he had lost something before, he subconsciously wanted to find something to make up for it. Chapter 1353. Yi Lianqiu lowered her head and looked at the person on her shoulder. She said faintly, Did you suddenly wake up? He didn't say anything. She chuckled and said, But I don't believe a word of it. Qin Anlin, I can't believe you. No matter how hungry I am, I won't dare to eat a piece of meat that you throw at me. He pressed her shoulder and closed his eyes. It doesn't matter if you don't believe me, because he had a lifetime to make her believe him. Yi Lianqiu's body was a little stiff. This was too much for her. Moreover, she didn't want to know. She was afraid that she wouldn't be willing to leave if she knew. Qin Anlin looked in her eyes and chuckled after a long time. Lianqiu, I don't think you'll leave without saying goodbye again, will you? Of course not. She pursed her lips. I'll leave in a while. Don't go. He grabbed her arm again. Lianqiu, don't go. She looked up and looked straight into his eyes. You're the one who asked me to go. He smiled bitterly. If others want to deal with me, so what if I go to City H? Lianqiu, stay. At least in City B he could still protect her. Yi Lianqiu's eyes fell on his face for a long time before she said softly, Qin Anlin, are you sure? Yes. He held her in his arms and murmured, Lianqiu, stay with me. Now that he said it, he realized how lonely he had been and how much he had missed her all these years. Perhaps giving up on her was the stupidest thing he had ever done in his life, but he didn't want to admit it. Fortunately, she was still here. Fortunately, she gave birth to their child. Fortunately, when she left him, she loved him. They hugged each other, but they didn't notice that little Mu Yun had woken up. The little guy rubbed his eyes and ran over to hug Qin Anlin's leg. His voice was as soft as a little animal's. Daddy. Qin Anlin's heart was also incredibly soft. He picked up the little fellow and said, Mu Yun, are you hungry? Daddy will take you to brush your teeth. Yi Mu Yun said in a small voice, Daddy, are you hurt? Qin Anlin kissed his little face. Of course, Daddy has an indestructible body. If you don't believe me, you can ask Mommy. Little Mu Yun turned to look at his mother. Yi Lianqiu sneered, Yeah, his skin is as thick as King Kong. I can't break it. Right? A gentle smile appeared on Qin Anlin's face as he looked at his son. See, Mommy already said yes. Could this person be any more thick-skinned? Yi Lianqiu didn't want to talk to him. She went to the ward to pack up her things. Qin Anlin took his son to brush his teeth and wash his face for breakfast. Little Mu Yin asked curiously. Daddy is not hurt. Why do you pretend? Qin Amlin sat and looked at his son's soft face. He pinched it. It felt good, and he was satisfied. Then he smiled. Because when adults fight, sometimes it's hard to understand what's going on. Little Mu Yin didn't understand. Qin Amlin said in the simplest words, sometimes you don't need to be too honest. Don't teach your son bad things. Yi Liangqiu's voice floated over. Qin Amlin looked at her and said, Yi Liangqiu, you are the least qualified to say this. Have you forgotten your dark history? What dark history do I have? She snorted. Chapter 1354. Little Mu Yin was a little gloomy. Daddy, are you talking about me? Also, when did Daddy bury him in Mommy's body? Did he sprout like a plant and grow up? Qin Amlin paused and coughed lightly. More or less. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. Qin Amlin, do you need me to tell Mu Yun about your dark past? His face darkened. The corner of Yi Liangqiu's mouth curled up. Qin Amlin couldn't help but take another look at her, and there was a hint of gentleness in his eyes. Little Mu Yin asked pitifully, is Daddy a little afraid of Mommy? Before Yi Liangqiu could say anything, Qin Amlin smiled lightly. Yes, Daddy was afraid that Mommy would be angry, so he gave in to her. A satisfied smile appeared on Xiao Muyun's usually cold and indifferent face. Qin Amlin reached out and rubbed his little head. I'll get a doctor I'm familiar with to examine you again later. However, he didn't expect that he would meet Pei Chi-Chi and Tang Yu. Little Mu Yin also met Xiaoxin, his little milk bun. When Little Mu Yin saw Xiaoxin, he felt that she was soft and fragrant, and her whole body seemed to exude a milky fragrance. She was like a little milk bun that had just come out of the steamer. If he bit her, she would definitely be fragrant and soft. Xiaoxin was so scared that she cried and hid in Tang Yu's arms proudly. After a while, she popped her fat little head out and looked at Little Mu Yun. When she saw the look in Little Mu Yun's eyes, she burst into tears again. Little Big Brother wanted to eat her up. Tang Yu coaxed her for a long time before she finally calmed down. However, her little heart would never turn back again. Instead, it faced this way and refused to come out again. Qin Amlin looked at Tang Yu holding his daughter and felt a little envious. He thought that if he and Liangqiu had a daughter, she would definitely be very cute and cute. It wasn't that he didn't love Mu Yun, but as a father, he liked his younger daughter more. With that thought in mind, his gaze shifted to Yi Liangqiu. His gaze moved down and naturally landed on her lower abdomen. He hadn't used any protection these days, and the so-called contraceptive pill she was taking was a vitamin. Maybe she was pregnant. He had to remember to be gentle the next time they had sex. Perhaps because his gaze was too passionate, Tang Yu clearly saw the meaning in his eyes. Amused, Zhang Xian sighed. Qin Amlin looked like a smart person, but he was actually mentally retarded when it came to relationships. However, his face revealed a faint smile, saying in an extremely magnanimous manner, Amlin, I owe you a favor. The weight of these words was very heavy. Qin Amlin could ask him to return the favor at any time. Qin Amlin's gaze fell on Pei Chi-Chi. She was the same. Their eyes met. The intimacy they once had could only turn into a greeting. It could only be a greeting. He smiled and said, okay. From the beginning to the end, Yi Liangqiu and Pei Chi-Chi's gazes only met lightly, and there wasn't much uneasiness. If something really happened between Pei Chi-Chi and Qin Amlin, then they would meet again. When they left, only Xiaoxin and Little Mu Yun would miss each other. They had nothing else to do with each other. That preposterous scene was now over. And Tang Yu, out of protection for Qin Amlin and Pei Chi-Chi, used some means to erase that marriage in New York. Chapter 1355. Qin Amlin was flipping through the documents. When he heard her words, he did not raise his head and merely asked indifferently, What do you mean? The feeling of seeing my ex-wife. She pursed her lips and harumphed coldly. He finally raised his head and looked at her. After a long while he smiled. Jealous? No. Her voice was a little childish. Qin Amlin continued to read the documents and said casually, Liangxiu, there's actually no need for that. For example, food. If there's something that you want to eat but can't eat it, after a long time, your appetite won't be as good, let alone reminiscing about it. Shameless. She glared at him and decided not to talk about this topic anymore. However, his interest seemed to be piqued as he walked to her and bent down to look at her. It's not like some things that you can't forget once you've eaten them and want to eat them again and again. Yi Lianqiu's face blushed as she glared at him. You're talking nonsense. You know very well whether I'm talking nonsense or not. Liangxiu, don't you miss it? He did not make things difficult for her, partly because he was busy. He straightened his body and pinched her face before leaving. To his surprise, he found that her touch was no worse than Mu Yun's. After his parents flirted, he did not expect that little Mu Yun would learn from them as well. Food? He couldn't forget it after eating it? No wonder he felt that his little heart was like a milk bun. So, that was the case. So, it could be eaten. Daddy ate Mummy. Little Mu Yun was initially feeling a little ashamed. But now, he felt that it couldn't be any more normal. He made up his mind that when that little milk bun grew up, he would eat her up. Qin Anlin stayed in the hospital for about a week. During this week, Su Chung came over once more. It was nothing much, and she just sat down. Yi Lianqiu did not meet with her and avoided her. She still couldn't forget how Yi Sun died. In the past few years, Mu Yun was unexpectedly born. Mu Yun's health wasn't good. Yi Sun's death could only be a hurdle in her heart. It was impossible for her to skip over Mu Yun to take revenge, but it didn't mean that she had forgotten. After sending off Su Chung, Qin Anlin saw her coming out with a dark expression. He wanted to tease her, but he didn't say anything in the end. She hadn't forgotten, and neither had he. Next week, ATV and King Entertainment will jointly hold a star ceremony. Come with me then. He paused for a moment. King Entertainment and ATV have reached a consensus that there will be a lot of cooperation in the next 3 years. However, Yi Lianqiu was focused on another question. She looked at him and asked calmly, "Is it your personal identity or your identity as a female artist from King Entertainment?" She was a little puzzled. Originally, Qin Anlin had wanted her to make a comeback, but after so many days, he hadn't mentioned this matter. She wanted to ask, but she didn't have such a plan, so it wasn't appropriate for her to ask. At this moment, Qin Anlin looked at her and smiled. "Of course it's as a female artist. Liangxiu, it's not time for our relationship to be made public yet." "Relationship? What relationship do I have with you?" Yi Lianqiu snorted coldly. "Don't be so shameless." Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. "No." He reached out and pulled her to the sofa, trapping one hand in his arms. Yi Lianqiu bit her lip. "Mu Yun is here." He lowered his head and kissed her lips, murmuring, "He's asleep." Chapter 1356. She panted a little and put her hands in front of her. "No." Qin Anlin. Her voice was soft and contained a hint of depression. Qin Anlin's lips moved to her ear. "Go to the bathroom." "Okay." She was really shy and had been teased by him like this, so she leaned on his shoulder and nodded slightly. So Qin Anlin, who was in the hospital, picked her up and carried her straight to the bathroom. As soon as the door was closed, he couldn't wait to kiss her lips. Their lips and teeth tangled, and their clothes fell to the ground. She was pressed against the cold wall, and his hot body was in front of her. Although he was eager, he was not in a hurry to take her. He kissed her and forced her. "Liangxiu, do you really want me?" She shook her head, and her expression was a little crazy. Qin Anlin reached out to pinch her cheeks and leaned forward to kiss her deeply. In the hopeless entanglement, his voice was sent into her mouth and crushed into pieces. "Liangxiu, you said you want me." She opened her eyes and then bit his neck. His gaze became deeper, and he took her in an instant. However, for some reason, perhaps because she was too excited or too nervous, her cooperation was a mess. She was in pain, and so was he. Amidst the chaos, she bit his neck. "Qin Anlin, don't you know how to read countless people?" He lowered his head and looked at the woman in his arms. It was as if he had gone back to many years ago when she was still a little girl. She was in pain, but she didn't dare to say it. She could only grit her teeth and bear it. At that time, he thought that her face would look good on the big screen. But now, he felt that she belonged to him alone, and no one else was allowed to see it. So he kissed the corner of her mouth and said meaningfully, "That was a long time ago." However, he tried to be as gentle as possible. He kissed her again and finally carried her into the bathtub. This was the best time for them. Their soul and body became one, and that was probably it. After Qin Anlin was discharged from the hospital, Yi Lianxiu and little Mu Yun moved directly into his apartment. He was very busy, but he still found time to accompany the mother and son. Madame Qin didn't approve of this, but Qin Anlin still insisted on going his own way. Especially when Lady Qin found out that Qin Anlin's female companion was Yi Lianxiu on the day of the Starlight Ceremony. She disapproved of it even more. She personally went to the headquarters of King Entertainment. Qin Anlin came back from a meeting and saw his mother. He smiled and said, "Mom, why are you here? If I didn't come, you would have probably forgotten your surname." Lady Qin's tone was a little harsh. "Anlin, you're too muddle-headed. You clearly know that ATV is eyeing King Entertainment. Why do you want Yi Lianxiu to be stuck in the middle? Don't you know that marrying Su Cheng is the best thing for us? You can use her to confuse Mr. Su's sight." "Anlin, I don't believe you didn't think of it." Of course, Qin Anlin thought of it, but he didn't want to do it. Without Lianxiu, he might, but now, he wouldn't hurt Lianxiu. Lianxiu would misunderstand, and she would run away again. He had been lonely and empty for so long. He didn't want to lose her again. Lady Qin's eyes lit up. "Why? Do you want to marry her? Is there something wrong with that?" Qin Anlin poured himself a glass of wine, but he didn't drink it. He remembered that he and Yi Lianxiu didn't really use contraception, so he didn't drink. And Lady Qin also realized that her son had changed. Anlin's lifestyle hadn't been this good in the past. Chapter 1357. As for why Qin Anlin had changed, Lady Qin knew very well in her heart. It was probably because of Yi Lianxiu. Thinking of this, she felt that Yi Lianxiu wasn't completely useless. At least in terms of temperament, although she was cold, she was indeed steadier than Su Cheng. From this point of view, Yi Lianxiu was obviously more suitable for Anlin, and Anlin also liked her. But what Lady Qin didn't like was Yi Lianxiu's family background. It was fine if she came from a small family, but it was also a broken one. She looked at Qin Anlin and pursed her lips. "Anlin, do you know her family and her past?" Qin Anlin said lightly, "That's not important." "That's very important," Lady Qin said seriously. Her mother had been living in a mental hospital before she died. Su Xiu went to investigate. 2 years before that woman died, Yi Lianxiu didn't go to see her. Think about it. How cruel is her heart? Lady Qin thought about it and felt a little cold. She treated her own mother like this. "Anlin, do you think her heart is made of iron?" She didn't want Anlin to walk the same path as her. She didn't want Anlin to be lost because he liked a woman too much. At least, she wanted to see how much Yi Lianxiu cared about Anlin. But she didn't. Yi Lianxiu obviously didn't care much about Anlin. In her eyes, there was only her son. Qin Anlin played with the wine glass in his hand. After a long time, he gently put it on the table. "I'll let her down first, Mom. You don't have to say any more. I want to marry her." He had a premonition that in the near future, Mr. Su and his mother would definitely think of a way for him to marry Su Cheng. Their goal was to bring each other down, and he was no longer willing to sacrifice the person he liked for his own benefit. With that, he stood up. "Mom, I still have a meeting to attend. Let's have lunch together at noon. If you're free at night, you can come back with me. Lianxiu is a good cook." His tone was exactly the tone of a son who had a family. Lady Qin was amused and annoyed at the same time. Finally, when he left, she sighed and said, "He has grown up." Crispy Sleeve laughed along. "Old mistress forgot. Young master is already in his 30s. Early 30s. Lady Qin murmured, "Su Xiu, Anlin is in his early 30s, and I'm not even 60, but you're already calling me old lady. Am I really old?" She looked at Lady Qin and hurriedly said, "Pooh, pooh, pooh. Old madam doesn't like to be called that. I won't call her that in the future." Lady Qin waved her hand. Forget it. Let's just call him that. She stood up. I don't want to eat lunch, let alone dinner. Crispy Sleeve supported her. That's good too. Young people have different tastes. It's good to eat separately. As she said that, she tried to sound her out. Old Madam can meet in the future. There's no rush. Lady Qin turned her head and looked at her. You. Do you think I don't know that you're feeling sorry for that ingrate and trying to get information out of me? Crispy Sleeve laughed. How could I? Who would dare to get information out of Old Madam? Lady Qin sighed. I know you all think that I'm unreasonable, but Sushio, I just want to give the best to Anlin. As for Yi Liangqiu, it was hard to tell how much she loved Anlin. This was what she was most dissatisfied with. Crispy Sleeve nodded and coaxed. Old Madam, what young master likes is the best, don't you think so? If he didn't like something, no matter how good it was, it would be useless to young master. Instead, it would be an eyesore. Crispy Sleeve comforted her gently. And young master will have a way to deal with the Su family. Don't worry, Old Madam. Chapter 1358. Soon it was Friday. At 8:30 p.m., the sky darkened. The Starlight Gala Charity Night, jointly organized by ATV and King Entertainment, had arrived. The gala was held in B City State Hall. It was a grand occasion. Half of the stars in the entertainment industry had arrived. The reporters were dressed to the nines and waiting on both sides of the red carpet. They were especially excited because tonight was Yi Liangqiu's comeback night. The first car slowly drove up the red carpet. The car door opened. It was ATV's president, Mr. Su, and his daughter, Su Chung. Su Chung was petite and wore a chiffon skirt. She had an exquisite figure, and her hair was not combed neatly. Instead, it was pulled back in a lazy bun. She looked pure and sexy. The reporters rushed forward to take photos. Su Chung stuck to Mr. Su like a little bird and struck a few poses to satisfy them. The reporters were most interested in ATV and King Entertainment's movements. They asked directly, President Su, there are rumors that King Entertainment President Qin and Miss Su Chung are getting married. What do you think? Mr. Su chuckled. I usually don't get involved in the affairs of young people. He paused. Our family is very democratic. Everything is based on Chung Ching's wishes. The reporters aimed their microphones at Su Chung. Su Chung smiled sweetly. I think women can't take the initiative in such matters. Everything depends on Anlin Ji's attitude. The words Anlin Gub had already explained Su Ching's attitude. The reporters were as excited as sharks smelling blood. At this moment of excitement, the second car arrived. As usual, it would be King Entertainment President Qin's car. The reporters swarmed forward and aimed their microphones at Qin Anlin. President Qin, why didn't you come with Miss Su Chung? Qin Anlin stood still and curled his lips. Are you questioning me? The reporters were stunned by his powerful aura. They were at a loss for words and couldn't continue. Qin Anlin ignored him. He reached out to hold the door and let the people in the car get out. Yi Liangqiu got out of the car in a black dress. Her shoulders deepened into a V shape. Her waist was tucked in, and the hem of her skirt was spread out. She even had a high split at the base of her thighs. Her slender and fair legs were extremely beautiful, especially when she stood beside Qin Anlin, who was 186 centimeters in height. They were a perfect match. Yi Liangqiu was an international best actress, so naturally, she had her own aura. Moreover, the media discovered that her skin did not show any signs of aging even though she had been out of the entertainment industry for more than 2 years. Instead, it had become fairer and more translucent, so fair that it was almost glowing. The reporters took photos like crazy, and all the questions surrounded Yi Liangqiu. Miss Yi, tonight is the night of your comeback. So what are your plans next? Plans? Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and looked up at Qin Anlin. You have to ask our President Qin. There was a touch of intimacy in her tone. If it was an ordinary person, they probably wouldn't be able to tell. But these reporters were all man-eating sharks. Their noses were sharper than dogs. How could they not tell? They were all excited all of a sudden. After all, Qin Amlin had a scandal with the little princess of ATV before, and now he was suddenly with Yi Lianxiu. Looking closely, there was a small secret between them. The handbag in Yi Lianxiu's hand was silver, and Qin Amlin's tie was also silver. If they were just artists from the company, they wouldn't give people the illusion that they were a couple. Qin Amlin smiled faintly. It depends on Miss Ye's physical condition. Chapter 1359. He said it vaguely, but the reporters could hear it clearly. This was probably preparing for pregnancy. One of the reporters coughed. What is the relationship between President Qin and Miss Yi now? Employment relationship. Relationship between a man and a woman. Yi Lianxiu and Qin Amlin spoke at the same time. After that, Yi Lianxiu glared at him. He smiled. Lianxiu, don't you think we should make our relationship public? Qin Amlin understood that in such an occasion, the Su family or his mother would find a way to force him and Su Cheng to be together. If that was the case, he might as well make his relationship with Yi Lianxiu public. That way, she wouldn't be able to run away. He could still guess what she was planning. After he said that, Yi Lianxiu was stunned. She looked up at him, not daring to believe what he had said. This bastard. He had clearly said that she would only accompany him as a celebrity. How did it become like this? Her stunned look was a little funny and also a little cute. Qin Amlin lowered his head and kissed her lips. In just 2 seconds, he left. However, she was even more shocked because there was a ring on her finger. She looked up and was stunned. That ring was the only one from the Zurich family. Because it was a rare 5-carat yellow diamond and it was in the shape of a crown. It was called Queen, and he put the Queen's ring on her finger. Yi Lianxiu didn't come back to her senses for a long time. She didn't know what he meant, because it was too strange. Do you like it? He smiled, held her hand, and said to the reporters generously, Yi Lianxiu, my future wife. Mr. Su and Su Cheng were stunned. They didn't expect that Qin Amlin would confirm Yi Lianxiu's identity under such circumstances when the situation wasn't stable. Does he not know that this will not do him any good? Mr. Su's eyes were inscrutable, and Su Cheng couldn't help but say, Amlin Gu, it's okay to spread rumors. But if you're serious, aren't you committing bigamy? No, she had to stop him. So she ignored Mr. Su's hint and brought up Pei Chi-Chi. The reporters were in an uproar. Qin Amlin looked at Su Cheng. Of course, he knew that he would make the Su family unhappy today. He could understand Mr. Su, but Su Cheng. He was sure that Su Cheng didn't like him, so why did she deliberately target him? Now was not the time to think about this. Qin Amlin had to think about Yi Lianxiu the most. However, he cared about her in his heart. This little ingrate might not think the same way about him. Yi Lianxiu gently stroked the ring with her fingers and smiled coldly. President Qin, so you have a wife. She wanted to take off the ring, but he stopped her. He held her hand in his and looked at her sternly. Yi Lianxiu, I dare you to take it off. She was shocked by him and didn't move for a long time. Qin Amlin smiled faintly. He actually pinched her cheek. Chapter 1360. Qin Amlin raised his hand and took out a pair of killer pliers. Miss Yi and my child is already 7 years old, so we will get married as soon as possible. The child is already 7 years old. The reporters were going crazy. All these years of paparazzi work had been in vain. The male lead was the head of King Entertainment, and the female lead was the heavenly queen of King Entertainment. These two actually had a child, and they hid it so well. But the poor little princess of ATV had been cannon fodder for so many years. After Qin Amlin said that, Yi Lianxiu stepped on his foot. She wanted to say something, wanted to deny it, but Qin Amlin bent down and kissed her. This time, it was a deep French kiss. He held her face in his palms, and his lips were glued to hers. He crushed the words she wanted to say, and then swallowed them into his stomach. This kiss was very hot. At first, it was pleasing to the eyes, but later on, the female reporter was too embarrassed to watch. Because the kiss was too deep, it was *****. Qin Amlin used up all his lung capacity and let go of her. Yi Lianqiu didn't have the temperament of a queen anymore. Her whole body was soft, and if it wasn't for him holding her up, she would have fallen. If you dare to say no, I will take you right now. His lips whispered against hers. To outsiders, it looked very lingering, but only she knew how shameless he was. Yi Lianqiu raised her head and glared at him. Qin Amlin smiled, and Mr. Su walked over with Su Cheng, smiling faintly as they gave their blessings. Mr. Su didn't seem to be forcing himself, but Su Cheng's eyes were a little red. She looked at Qin Amlin with a sorrowful gaze, which made people think of a love triangle. However, Qin Amlin only treated Su Cheng as heir. He was also the best actor. He rubbed Su Cheng's hair and said, "Little girl, what's wrong? Are you still reluctant to part with me after being my shield for so many years?" Not to mention Mr. Su and Su Cheng. Even Yi Lianqiu was shocked by Qin Amlin's words. With just one sentence, he had cleanly absolved himself of all responsibility. He was really the best actor. Even Yi Lianqiu had to admit that she was inferior to him. Then there was some drama. The four of them stood together to be photographed. Even though Su Cheng was leaning against Qin Amlin pulled Yi Lianqiu to his side. Their fingers were tightly intertwined, and the father and daughter next to them became a watchboard. This photo also became a headline. Qin Amlin's hand never let go. Yi Lianqiu went from being the queen of music to being Mrs. Qin. All the celebrities came one after another. But no matter how big the superstars were, they couldn't suppress the explosive news today. Qin Amlin and Yi Lianqiu were on the hot search list at the fastest speed. Even Yi Muyun's identity was exposed. The ceremony began. Yi Lianqiu and Qin Amlin sat side by side. She said in a low voice, "Why did you do this? Is it not good?" He looked at the MC lightly and smiled. "Or, do you want to see me marry Su Cheng?" There is no relationship between the two. She was a little annoyed. His fingers grabbed her hand and held her firmly in his. He said in a low voice, "Even if you don't marry her, it will probably take a long time. Lianqiu, I'm a little tired. I don't want to continue like this." He played the man's trick to the extreme, but she actually didn't hear it and looked up at him. Chapter 1361. The scale of tonight's ceremony was huge. Celebrities from all walks of life were invited to the stage by the MC to donate. Su Cheng had donated 10 million yuan, which was considered a huge sum. When she got off the stage, she looked at Yi Lianqiu provocatively. Yi Lianqiu smiled and lifted the hem of her dress to go up the stage. She was considered the finale. She reached out and took the microphone from the MC. "Well, I think everyone knows that I've been out of the entertainment industry for the past few years. So I think President Qin should express his gratitude for my help this time." Her gaze fell on Qin Amlin. "I wonder if President Qin has any objections?" The MC immediately rushed down and moved closer to the microphone. "Our Empress Yi just showered us with dog food. What do you think, President Qin?" The MC asked as she incited everyone present. "President Qin, how about 20 million yuan for a kiss from the beauty?" Everyone was excited at once, and they were all clamoring for a kiss. Qin Amlin stood up and looked at Yi Lianqiu. "What do you think, Ms. Yi?" Yi Lianqiu smiled faintly. "Forget about the kiss. We can have a dance." Qin Amlin leaned sideways and said a few words to the MC. The MC immediately understood and smiled excitedly. "Ms. Yi has auctioned the first dance tonight. President Qin will donate 20 million yuan in Ms. Ye's name." He walked in front of the pianist and said something. The stage darkened, and only a beam of light shone on Yi Lianqiu. She stood there alone, lonely and beautiful. It was quiet all around. Everyone could hear the song. It was called Waiting. Qin Amlin walked slowly towards Yi Lianqiu. He walked to her side step by step and lowered his head. "Do you remember, Lianqiu? This was the song we played when we danced for the first time." She looked up at him and said in a hoarse voice, "Do you remember?" He nodded, put his arm around her waist, and gently put her on his shoulder. The music was gentle, and his gaze was even more gentle. Suddenly, she rested her face on his shoulder, not daring to look at his eyes, because she was afraid that if she saw it, she would not bear to leave. Having her heart broken once was enough. Yes, she did not want to be with him forever. She wanted to get pregnant and leave him. From now on, she would never appear in front of him again. He held her in his arms and turned around gently. He smiled faintly. "Leoncio, you're scared." "Huh? I didn't." She buried her face in his shoulder and said in a low voice, "No. You're still trembling?" He smiled and pulled her into his arms. He hugged her tightly enough to protect her. They were in public, so Leoncio was a little shy. "Chin Amlin, people will laugh." "Then let them laugh." He straightened her face and looked at her with his dark eyes. His footsteps had already stopped. He held her face in his hands and looked at her intently. Everything around them had disappeared. It was as if they were the only two people left in the world. She raised her head and looked at him helplessly. Her breathing started to become erratic and unstable. She called out to Chin Amlin softly, and her voice was already trembling a little. He grunted vaguely and finally leaned forward to kiss her lips. Heaven and earth, everything calmed down. Only eternity was left. At this moment, he actually wanted to cry. His voice was low and hoarse. "Leoncio, I feel that I've never liked someone so much before." It was not infatuation, nor was it impulsive. It was nostalgia. Nostalgia for everything that they used to have. Chapter 1362. Leoncio's body didn't move. She let him hug and kiss her, but she didn't respond. He seemed to be unwilling to give up. Their lips rubbed against each other more intensely. Only then did she retreat a little. "I'm not interested in performing. This is not a performance. I can't help it." He laughed and finally let go of her. However, he kept holding her hand. Tonight was enjoyable. He wanted to send her off the stage. However, he had only taken 2 steps when the chandelier above suddenly made a crisp and fragile sound. He looked up and saw that the crystal chandelier was on the verge of falling. It happened to be right above Leoncio. He exerted a little force and pulled her into his arms. The two of them fell to the ground together. Then there was a loud sound. The crystal chandelier directly hit Chin Amlin's waist. The sharp crystal pierced his skin, and the chandelier smashed into him, causing him to let out a muffled groan. However, he had been holding Leoncio in his arms the whole time. He hugged her carefully as if he was holding a treasure. At this moment, everyone believed that his love for her was true. That was because human instincts could not be deceived. Chin Amlin lay there for a long time before he moved. His palm was placed on Leoncio's lower abdomen. He was afraid that she was pregnant. "Leoncio, are you okay?" His face rested on her neck. His voice was unbelievably hoarse and a little weak. At this moment, everyone around them let out a scream. God, it was too scary. Su Chung was the first to run over. She knelt in front of them and touched Leoncio with a trembling finger. "Sister Leoncio, are you okay?" A light flashed across Chin Amlin's eyes. He was covered in blood, but Su Chung didn't care. Instead, she asked if Leoncio was okay. What kind of feelings did Su Chung have for Leoncio? Chin Amlin closed his eyes and recalled his attitude toward Shun Lian when he was young. The more he liked her, the more he didn't want to talk to her, and the more he pretended to hate her. Su Chung, is it the same? Before he could think too much, Mr. Su had also come over and pulled Su Chung up. Then he looked at Chin Amlin and said, "She seems to have fainted." "Amlin, can you move?" Chin Amlin had never been so embarrassed. He gritted his teeth and said, "Maybe not." Mr. Su pursed his lips and called the staff to bring a stretcher to carry Chin Amlin on it. After that, he carried Leoncio in his arms. "Find a room for her and call a doctor over." Mr. Su's reaction made Chin Amlin's eyes narrow. Although it was painful, his brain had not rusted yet. "There's no need. Let her go to the hospital with my ambulance." Chin Amlin had other plans in mind. It would be best if Leoncio could go to the hospital for a checkup. Moreover, he didn't feel safe leaving her here. Mr. Su hesitated for a moment and said, "That's fine too." Because the injured person was a celebrity, the ambulance and the police arrived very quickly. The scene was secured and Qin Anlin and the unconscious Yi Liangxiu were sent to Xingyuan Hospital. He didn't dare to sleep. He couldn't sleep under such circumstances. He had to protect her. Kam went to the scene immediately and got the news that it was an accident. When he arrived at the hospital, Qin Anlin could only lie on his stomach after the doctor removed the shrapnel from his back. He didn't use anesthesia because he had a lot of things to do. Make some arrangements at the police station. Don't make any conclusions. Just say that it was man-made. We need to find the real culprit. Qin Anlin's eyes were deep. He pursed his lips and said calmly, "I want to see what Mr. Su and Su Qing are thinking." Chapter 1363. Kaim nodded. "I understand, President Qin." Qin Anlin looked at Yi Liangxiu, who was still unconscious, and pursed his lips. "Don't let her know." Kaim's eyes were a little complicated. It seemed that President Qin was serious. After saying this, Qin Anlin was also a little sleepy. He propped himself up and said, "Let's waste some more time. We don't have to do it ourselves. I think Mr. Su and Su Chung will bite each other. It will be a good show then." After Kaim left, Qin Anlin lay on his stomach and looked at Yi Liangxiu, who was lying on the bed. The doctor had already checked her, and there was nothing wrong with her. She just fainted from fear. "I thought you were more daring than I thought. Useless little thing." As he spoke, a faint smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. He took his phone and dialed the number of his mother's house. It was Su Xiu. "Aunt Su, Liangxiu and I had a small accident. We're in the hospital now. Go to the apartment and pick up Mu Yun. Don't let my mother know for the time being," Qin Anlin said softly. He had his own considerations. His mother didn't like Liangxiu very much. If she knew that he was injured to save Liangxiu, she might dislike him even more. Su Xiu was also a little surprised, but hearing that there was nothing wrong with his tone, she immediately went to do it. With nothing to worry about, Qin Anlin fell into a deep sleep. His hand crossed the middle of the bed and held her hand. "Liangxiu, I don't want to let go of your hand again." The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Yi Liangxiu woke up in the middle of the night. Before she opened her eyes, she smelled disinfectant. She slowly opened her eyes and looked around by Su. She knew that she was in the hospital. She moved a little and didn't feel any discomfort. She only felt a little dizzy and hungry. Her hand was held by someone. She looked over and saw Qin Anlin. He was sprawled on the bed with his face tilted towards her, sleeping soundly. Perhaps it was because of sleep, but his face looked much calmer and younger than usual. She recalled how he had pounced on her and held her in his arms. Her heart wavered. She gently broke free from his hand and gently placed it on his face, caressing his facial features. "How do you feel?" His deep voice rang out. She jerked her hand back and tried to leave, but he caught it. He grabbed her hand and half forced her to wander on his face. His voice was also a little soft. "Liangxiu, are you worried about me?" "President Qin, you think very highly of yourself." Her voice was deliberately cold. He just looked at her, and after a while he laughed softly. "Is that so? Then why wasn't the first thing you did when you woke up to escape? Why didn't you take off the ring?" Her face was a little hot, and she stared at him for a long time without saying anything. Qin Anlin smiled. "Liangxiu, it's not embarrassing to be worried about me." His gaze was a little warm and a little regretful. She wasn't pregnant. He had hoped that she would be pregnant so that she wouldn't be able to run away. Yi Liangxiu lowered her eyes, and after a while, she bit her lip. "Are you hungry?" Qin Anlin smiled. "I want to eat you more. Don't go too far." She glared at him. Qin Anlin laughed. He looked at her for a while before he chuckled. "I probably don't have the stamina for that now. Liangxiu, don't work too hard. You can eat tomorrow morning." He had seen her get off the bed and hurriedly stopped her. The doctors and nurses all covered their mouths and laughed. Yi Lianxiu was even more ruthless, didn't he like to moan? That was good enough. But then he screamed so miserably that she couldn't bear it anymore, so she softened her hands and feet. I know our little Lianxiu loves me. He was shameless again. If he could move now, he would definitely hug her and kiss her. Yi Lianxiu's face was a little hot. You're hurt like this, but you're still not obedient. Qin Amlin didn't say anything, but his heart was incredibly soft. Chapter 1365. Mr. Su looked at Lady Qin for a long time before smiling. As long as Amlin is happy, it's fine. Chung Chung is still young. There's no rush. The two old men looked at each other, each with their own ulterior motives. When they finally entered the ward, the doctors and nurses stepped aside. Yi Lianxiu was still helping Qin Amlin apply medicine. Qin Amlin was still shouting, sounding like a lost soul. Lady Qin was a traditional woman. Even though she was old, she could not help but scold. Amlin, you're too much. Qin Amlin turned to look at Lady Qin and said, Mom, President Su, you're here. Mr. Su's gaze fell on Yi Lianxiu's face. After a long time, he said softly, It seems there's nothing urgent. Qin Amlin also noticed his gaze and smiled faintly. Yes, it's nothing much. He reached out and tugged on Yi Lianxiu's finger. All right, let's bandage it up. His voice was warm, just like a husband talking to his wife. Yi Lianxiu pursed her lips and nodded. She helped him bandage it up with some difficulty. This time, it wasn't because she wanted to cry out, but rather because her technique really wasn't very good. As a result, Qin Amlin grunted twice. Lady Qin could not stand it anymore. She coughed lightly. Let the nurse do it. No need. Qin Amlin propped himself up and let Yi Lianxiu support him. He did not look good. He had lost a lot of blood. Thank you for coming to see me, President Su. Mr. Su smiled. I had asked Ching Ching to come, but she refused to come. So, I had to come myself. He sighed. Amlin, seeing that you have found someone to spend the rest of your life with, Uncle is happy for you. With that, Mr. Su took out a box and handed it to Yi Lianxiu. This is a small gift from me and Annie Su. Don't forget to treat us to a drink when you get married. Yi Lianxiu looked up at Mr. Su hesitantly. ATV and King Entertainment were fighting fiercely. Could she accept this gift? Besides, if she accepted it, it would be tacitly agreeing to her and Qin Amlin's marriage. She had not thought it through yet. At this time, Mrs. Qin said faintly, Hurry up and accept it. Say thank you. Her voice was quite dignified. Yi Lianxiu had never been afraid of Madame Qin before, but now he was a little timid. He had fallen for her tricks, so he took it and thanked her softly. Lady Qin turned to Mr. Su and said, She's still young and doesn't understand. Please forgive her. Qin Amlin glanced at Yi Lianxiu with a meaningful look. Young? Yi Lianxiu glanced at him. If there was no one around, she would have scratched his back. He deserved the pain. Mr. Su could not help but smile. That is right. Bing Xiu and Ching Chung are about the same age, but she's much more promising than my daughter. Liang Xiu won several international awards at the age of 19, while Ching Ching only knows how to spend money and doesn't care about production. As he spoke, he shook his head. Chapter 1366. She didn't know much about these things, but Lady Qin knew it at a glance. Lady Qin looked at Yi Lianxiu with some surprise. After a long time, she said softly, I remember that this was Mrs. Su's dowry. She cherished it very much. I could see her wearing it in the early years, but I haven't seen it since. Yi Lianxiu handed it to Lady Qin, and Lady Qin looked at it carefully again. It's a good mutton fat white jade. It's worth 10,000 gold. Keep it well. You're probably also in Mr. Su's eyes. Yi Lianxiu put it away. She didn't realize that Lady Qin's attitude was enough to show that she had softened and agreed with her marriage with Qin Amlin. She had been in a trance, and she didn't notice that Qin Amlin had stared at her for a long time. Lianxiu, go and buy me breakfast. He asked her to leave and asked for the special breakfast of a hotel. Yi Lianxiu glanced at him, changed her clothes, and went out. After she left, Lady Qin said with a smile, "She is usually cold, but she has become a little wife in your place." Qin Amlin furrowed his brows, then relaxed. He looked at his mother and chuckled. "Mom, do you think it's like this? Look at how useless you are." Lady Qin sighed. "She is always not the one I am most satisfied with. But if you insist, I won't object." Qin Amlin's eyes fell in the direction of the door. After a while, he said, "Lianxiu is very good. Don't be fooled by her cold appearance. She is still a little girl." He felt a little sorry for her in his heart. It was true that he had read countless people, and it was also true that she only had him from beginning to end. Lin Xingyuan was never a problem. If Lianxiu and that man were really together, they would have been together a long time ago. Why did they wait until now? If there was only one time, I wouldn't have missed these 6 years. Qin Amlin looked at his mother. "I really like her." And it took him 6 years to realize this fact. He didn't want to miss another 6 years. Lady Qin couldn't help but scold him. "Don't tell me whether you have a good or bad life in the future. It's your own choice." Although it was a little cruel and unpleasant, she agreed. Qin Amlin slowly straightened his body and smiled. "Mom, thank you." Mrs. Qin looked at her son's serious expression and felt a lump in her throat. However, she still stubbornly said, "Don't talk to me like that. Look at you." But thinking about it, it was a good thing that his son was willing to learn and not mess around. It was because of Shun Lian that Amlin had been fooling around with women for so many years. That was why he had given up on Yi Lianxiu for 6 years. Thinking of Shun Lian, Lady Qin sighed again. Shun Lian had been dead for 2 years. That woman had dug her own grave. When Yi Lianxiu came back, Lady Qin was gone. Qin Amlin looked at her with a faint smile. She put down the breakfast and glanced at him. "I didn't agree to get married." Qin Amlin sat down and started eating breakfast. He was really hungry, but he also threw something to her and said in a muffled voice, "This is for you from Mom. She said she'll pick something for you when we get back." Yi Lianxiu glanced at him and opened the big box. Opening it, there was a set of sapphire jewelry inside. It was a classic design and extremely expensive. Chapter 1367. Yi Lianxiu knew a little about it. A set of such quality and weight was worth at least tens of millions. She closed it and returned it to him. "I can't accept it." "Why can't you accept it?" Qin Amlin threw it back to her. "Take it and play with it. I'll buy you a new one in the future." "What brother?" "Pervert." She looked at him. "Lianxiu." He put down the spoon in his hand and said seriously, "I think the whole world knows about our marriage. Do you think you can afford to ruin it with your popularity?" He paused and reminded her, "Our son has been exposed. Do you think it's a good thing for Mu Yun's future if we don't get married?" Yi Lianxiu was a little angry. "Qin Amlin, you're too despicable." He sighed. "I admit it. But Lianxiu, I'm just afraid of missing out on you. The wedding appointment is in a month's time. Lianxiu, shall we get married?" This time, he was very sincere and asked seriously. She looked at him and suddenly hesitated and wavered. She thought of Mu Yun. Indeed, as he said, this was the best path for Mu Yun. But she thought of his past. "Qin Amlin, if there's someone else by your side one day, I'll leave you." She said firmly, "I won't hesitate. I won't let you find me again." It was enough to forgive a person once in a lifetime. Qin Amlin's throat seemed to be blocked, although she hadn't said that she hated him before. But now that she said it, it proved that she had resentment in her heart, and now she had let go of that resentment. "No, there won't be anyone else." He put his arm around her shoulders. "Lianxiu, I promise there won't be anyone else." Holding her was like holding the whole world, but at this moment of contentment, he actually felt a little uneasy. Perhaps if he cared too much, he would start worrying about personal gains and losses. Mr. Su returned to the Su family's mansion. The car stopped, but he did not enter the door immediately. Instead, he stood in front of the tree at the door. It was not long ago that he found out that Liangxiu was his daughter. That time, he stood upstairs and saw Yi Liangxiu standing at the door in a daze. Although he was far away, he saw her dig out a box under the tree at the entrance. He remembered that his precious Su Su had once climbed onto his knees and told him that she had an appointment with Brother Anlin Go, and that the appointment was under the tree in front of the door. No one else knew about this. How did Yi Liangxiu find that box so easily? He sent someone to pull the hair of a Yi Liangxiu and did a DNA test. Yi Liangxiu was his Su Su, his precious Su Su. He had found his daughter, but he could not recognize her. She was Qin Anlin's woman, and King Entertainment was something he had been longing for and scheming for his entire life. Su Su, bear with it a little longer. Daddy will bring you back. Daddy will give you everything to make up for all the pain you have suffered all these years. Mr. Su stood under the tree for a moment, then slowly walked into the Su family's mansion. Behind him, a white sports car slowly drove over. The car window rolled down, and Su Cheng's face was on the screen. The old man must have known something. Did he really want her to marry Qin Anlin? Not necessarily. Looking at it now, it was obvious that he wanted his own daughter to marry him. Then, would he leave the ATV to her, Su Cheng? Su Cheng did not dare to dream about this. Hatred surfaced in her eyes. Chapter 1368. Mrs. Su had not returned from her bestie gathering, so only Mr. Su and Su Cheng were left in the Su mansion. That night, Su Cheng heard from the housekeeper that Mr. Su had drunk a little and was not feeling well. There was a tray in the female manager's hands, and on top of it was a hangover soup. "I'll give it to my dad." Su Cheng smiled, took the tray, and slowly walked upstairs. Her heart beat faster with every step she took. She opened the door of the master bedroom and stood at the door. She saw Su Shirching lying on the sofa with an empty cup on the table beside him. There was a faint smell of liquor in the air. It seemed that he had drunk a lot. Su Cheng walked over and stepped on the wool carpet. Her steps were very light, so Su Shirching did not notice. Putting the soup aside, Su Cheng squatted down and called softly, "Dad." Su Shirching did not respond at first. Su Cheng looked around. At this time, her hand was caught. It was a strong grip. She looked down and saw Su Shirching's face turn to her, but his eyes were still closed. "Honka, is that you?" Su Shirching murmured. His fingers held her hand and rubbed it a few times. There was a sense of nostalgia. Su Cheng was a little shocked. "Honka?" Honka was Lady Qin's real name. Su Shirching and the Qin family were old friends, but he actually wanted Lady Qin. Su Cheng pursed her lips and did not dare to pull her hand away. Su Shirching was really drunk. At this moment, he felt like he had returned to the past, back to his childhood. "Honka, you're back, aren't you? You didn't want to marry him, did you?" Su Shirching closed his eyes and smiled bitterly. "Why did you marry him? I've liked you for so many years. Why did you marry him?" He held Su Cheng's hand tightly. After pondering for a while, he murmured, "You see, I randomly found a woman and he left with someone else." "Honka, why are you guarding him like this?" Su Cheng's eyes widened. She knew a thing or two about the Qin family. It turned out that the past was Su Shirching's doing. The one who tore apart a family and ruined Lady Qin's life turned out to be Su Shirching, her hypocritical father. Su Cheng's heart was beating very fast. She understood that if Su Shirching woke up at this time, she would probably be doomed eternally. He would never let her stay. "Honka, we are not fated to be together. Look, our children are fated to be together. Our children are already so big." Su Shirching held his forehead with his other hand and smiled bleakly. They are getting married. However, he still could not forget that hatred. He could not forget the hatred that he had yearned for her all his life, but could not obtain. "So, Honka, I want to take away everything from the Qin family and make you have no one to rely on. That way, will you be able to see the good in me and forget that heartless person?" Su Shirching was drunk and vomited too much. When Su Cheng went out, she was in a trance. It turned out that Su Shirqing knew everything. He knew that Yi Liangxiu was his child, and everything was under his control. She, Su Cheng, was just a small chess piece of him. Letting her marry Qin Anlin was just a cover from the beginning to the end. She pursed her lips tightly and clenched her fists. She knew that she would lose her value soon. At that time, she would really die. The next morning, at breakfast time, Su Cheng got up very early for the first time, but there was a touch of bruise under her eyes that couldn't be covered with powder. Chapter 1369. She noticed that Mrs. Su's face was glowing today, probably because they had sex last night. Su Cheng only felt pity for her. After spending so many years together, every time she lay under Su Shirqing, she would never imagine that her husband would close his eyes and think of that old woman, Lady Qin. In terms of appearance, Mrs. Su looked 20 years younger than Lady Qin. She couldn't figure out why Su Shirqing was so obsessed with Lady Qin, who was already an old lady. Mrs. Su looked at Su Cheng and waved her hand. Cheng, you got up early today. Come and have breakfast. Your Annie Hong made your favorite sandwiches. Su Cheng raised the corner of her mouth. Annie Hong? If she didn't forget, there was still Annie Ku at home. What a complete set. She just didn't know if the male master had doted on all of them. She sat down and smiled sweetly at Mrs. Su. I have to thank Annie Hong. Mrs. Su looked at her beloved daughter's face full of love. She tucked her daughter's hair and said, You should also focus these few days. Don't fool around outside all day. Go to the company and help your father. In the future, who else will your father give the family business to if not you? Su Cheng murmured vaguely. Mrs. Su looked up at Mr. Su and asked meaningfully, Is it Shirqing? Mr. Su folded the newspaper in his hand and looked at Su Cheng. He smiled faintly. Girls should be raised well. Don't worry. Didn't Hong could do a good job in the past few years? Our Cheng is so smart. She can do it too. Mrs. Su inadvertently poked Mr. Su's sore spot, but he didn't feel it. He still looked at Su Cheng lovingly. Su Cheng's heart beat faster, and she secretly glanced at Mr. Su. Mr. Su paused and looked at Su Cheng. Did you give Dad the soup to sober up last night? He must have asked the female manager about it. Su Cheng smiled sweetly at him and said, Yes. But no matter how I call Dad, you won't wake up. Mom is the best. Mrs. Su blushed and scolded her. You're just a kid. Don't talk nonsense. Su Cheng took the opportunity to act coquettishly. How is it nonsense? Daddy loves Mommy very much. Those words pleased Mrs. Su. She smiled and stroked Su Cheng's hair. Our Cheng is the most obedient. Su Cheng looked at Mrs. Su and smiled sweetly. Mom is the best. Well, let's eat. Mr. Su glanced at them. Before breakfast was finished, Mr. Su's private lawyer, Lawyer Zhang, came over. Mr. Su stood up. Let's talk upstairs. The two went upstairs together. Su Cheng looked at their backs and then at Mrs. Su. Mom, why do you think Lawyer Zhang came here so early in the morning? Who knows about their men's affairs? Mrs. Su was really proud of herself this morning, and her face was full of lust. Su Cheng sneered in her heart. Some women didn't understand the meaning of life. They thought they were very happy, but they didn't know that the person next to them was always thinking about someone else. Mom, I'm done. I'll go upstairs to touch up my makeup, and then I'll go to work with Dad. Su Cheng kissed Mrs. Su's face affectionately. Mrs. Su laughed and scolded. You mischievous girl. She was in a good mood. In addition to the sweet love she had with Mr. Su last night, Qin Anlin was going to marry someone else. Her Cheng didn't have to be sacrificed anymore. Chapter 1370. Su Cheng quietly went upstairs. When she reached the study, her footsteps paused. The door of the study was closed, so she could not hear it clearly. Then, she stuck her ear to the door and heard Su Shirqing's voice. Remove Su Cheng's name from the will. and replace it with Yi Lianqiu's name. Su Cheng's fingers clenched tightly. Lawyer Zhang was not surprised and nodded. Okay. However, he added, should we keep some so that the child's future life will be guaranteed? However, Su Shiqing's cold voice was heard. I have found my biological daughter. I don't need it anymore. Su Cheng's legs were a little weak. No need, no need. Yes, she was a fake. Now that the real one was back, there was no need. Although she had already guessed that this would be the end, she still felt sad. She had called them daddy and mommy for so many years. She used to really love them. She did not really want the ATV, but she was not willing to accept that she was just a substitute. That night, Su Cheng flew to H-City. At 10 o'clock in the evening, in the bedroom of a villa, she made love to a man. After it was over, she turned to one side and lay down to look at everything around her. He sat up, took a long and thin cigarette between his lips, and took a puff. Are you in love with her? The man sat up and turned his head. How could that be? Su Cheng took a few puffs in frustration. Then, she pressed the cigarette, but into Lin Xingyuan's mouth. She stared into his eyes and said coldly, I told you to pester her, not to fall in love with her. Do you understand? Lin Xingyuan's pupils contracted. After a long time, he said softly, Cheng Cheng, you are the only one in my heart. It's good that you know. Su Cheng stared at him. She stretched out her slender fingers and slid them down his orifices. Bit by bit, it was as if she was picking beans. After a long time, she stopped and whispered something in his ear. Lin Xingyuan looked at her. His eyes were filled with surprise and also fear. What? You don't want to? Su Cheng's eyes flashed with displeasure. Didn't you say that you would be loyal to me forever and only love me? Lin Xingyuan pursed his lips and reached out to hug her. He buried his face in Su Cheng's neck. So, Cheng Cheng, don't make things difficult for me, okay? Can't bear to part with it? Su Cheng laughed coldly and pushed him away. Lin Xingyuan, in your heart, is it me or her? If it's me, then do as I say. Lin Xingyuan looked at her. After a long time, he smiled bitterly. Cheng Cheng, you know, for you, I am willing to do anything. Su Cheng was instantly happy. She hugged Lin Xingyuan and said in a low voice, again. Lin Xingyuan's body stiffened, but he quickly cooperated. Su Cheng lay down on the messy bed sheets and closed her eyes. When he couldn't see her, her face was full of disgust. Every time she came into contact with him, there was a purpose behind it. She did not enjoy it at all. She did not like doing this at all. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and looked down at Lin Xingyuan's head. What is it? Lin Xingyuan leaned on her body and panted. I'm a little tired. Su Cheng pursed her lips. Then, when you are with Yi Lianqiu, you won't feel powerless, will you? Lin Xingyuan's fingers continued to comfort her body. His voice whispered into her ear. Cheng Cheng, will you let me touch her? Of course not. Su Cheng's voice was firm. If you dare, I can guarantee that I will kill you. Lin Xingyuan paused for a long time. Suddenly, he propped himself up and looked at her. Cheng Cheng, do you love me? Chapter 1371. Qin Amlin stayed in the hospital for a week, and Yi Lianqiu also took care of him for a week. His wounds slowly healed, but they left permanent scars on his body, especially on the side of his waist. There was a 10-meter-long wound that could never be erased. He lay on his stomach, and Yi Lianqiu helped him apply medicine. Her fingers moved gently and slowly, and she felt a little scared. At that time, and when she woke up later, she saw that he was fine and didn't feel scared. But after thinking about it, she still felt scared. If the chandelier had fallen on his head, the consequences would be unimaginable. Why? Do you feel sorry for me? Qin Amlin's voice was faint, but there was a hint of a smile. He sat up, tied up his bathrobe, and looked at her with a clear gaze. Yi Lianqiu glanced at him. Who feels sorry for you? Don't flatter yourself. You're going to get married, but you're still so stubborn. He put his finger on her lips. On the night of the wedding, I must make you soft. he said shamelessly, and Yi Liangqiu couldn't bear to listen to it. She got off the bed. I'm going to be discharged in a while. I need to pack my things. Let the servants come and pack. Rest for a while. He naturally said that with her status, this kind of thing should have been done by someone else a long time ago. Yi Liangqiu paused and said softly, I'm used to doing it myself. He felt bad when she said that. After a while, he pulled her into his arms and said with a warm voice, In the future, we'll do it together. After saying that, he laughed and looked down at Yi Liangqiu. Why? Isn't it funny? Her voice was cold. It's not funny at all. All right. He reached out to touch his nose and coughed. Liangqiu, don't you think that we don't look like people who are going to get married? Yi Liangqiu snorted. Who wants to marry you? He looked at her, and there was a hint of danger in his gaze. The next second, she was trapped under his body, and she also felt that he was on the verge of exploding. Qin Anlin. She bit her lip and glared at him. You're injured. His fingers gently caressed her lips. His voice was very slow, but there was a hint of tension in it. This doesn't stop me from wanting you. It's daytime. You can't do anything during the day. He's in the hospital now. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and glared at him. Qin Anlin chuckled and looked at her. Liangqiu, it's not like we haven't done it before in the hospital. His voice was a little light. I remember the last time at the hospital, you screamed quite happily. He leaned close to her ear and whispered dirty words. It was pretty tight that time. Get up. She pushed him with a charming blush on her face. Qin Anlin's heart softened, and his voice was unprecedentedly gentle. Then let's go back to the apartment and do it. I don't want to do it with you. She glared at him. Qin Anlin, you're shameless. He actually nodded in agreement. I think so too. But soon he became serious. Liangqiu, if I were shameless, you would probably fly away. So, I'd rather be shameless. At least I can have you again. His handsome face was magnified in front of her eyes, Liangqiu. He suddenly hugged her in his arms again and buried her face in his chest. Some words were actually very difficult to say. She was a little shy. Have I ever said that I love you? She had liked him unknowingly, and now she realized that it was a deep love. He bent down slightly and was a little close to her. His voice was low and pleasant. Let's get out. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and knew that he wasn't thinking of anything good, so she refused to get out of the car. Qin Anlin looked at her and chuckled softly. He reached out and picked her up horizontally. Chapter 1373. She was stunned for a moment before she struggled and kicked him, sounding a little annoyed. Qin Anlin, let go of me, you pervert. Qin Anlin began to chuckle lowly. Sticking close to her ear, he said warmly, It seems like you know what I want to do. He kicked the car door shut and carried her to the elevator. With every step, she could feel the changes in his body. Her face was a little hot as she turned away. Shameless. He bit her ear. Liangqiu, didn't you miss me? As he said that, he seemed to be a little aroused and couldn't help himself. He sucked on her little mouth and said in a low voice, Little Qiu, tell me, did you miss me too? It was so mushy. But her body felt as though it had been electrified, and she couldn't describe the feeling. Yi Liangqiu bit her lip and looked at him with watery eyes. Qin Anlin let out a long sigh. This was practically asking for his life. He kissed her lips again and murmured, Liangqiu, don't look at me like that. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'll have you in the elevator. Her face was flushed red as she looked at him with widened eyes. Little fool. He kissed her once and then again. Honestly speaking, Yi Liangqiu was a cold and aloof person. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many fans calling her hubby. But in Qin Anlin's eyes, she was a cute little fool. And a 19-year-old girl at that. She was still in his arms and kissed. Yi Liangqiu couldn't take it anymore and turned her face away. Qin Anlin, you're a dog. He licked her face until his saliva was all over her face. But he didn't restrain himself at all and chuckled softly. Is the dog licking better or me? She glared at him. She couldn't believe that this scoundrel in front of her was the Cheen Anlin of King Entertainment. As they kissed, the elevator reached the top floor. He carried her and swiped the door. He didn't leave but pressed himself against the door and entered. He kicked the door shut, and she was pressed against the door and kissed. She wanted to struggle, but one of his long legs quickly trapped her, and she couldn't move. It was as if she was sitting on one of his legs. Through a thin layer of fabric, she felt a fiery heat. Her body trembled, and she couldn't help but raise her head. His hot lips pressed against her neck, and his voice was hoarse. Liang Xiao, you said you wanted me. She lowered her head angrily and bit him on the ear. Cheen Anlin chuckled. He held her waist with one hand and moved his other hand downwards. With just a few movements, she let out a wail. They were a little messy. The rhythm was a little messy, very messy, and a little painful. Just like that, he carried her into the bedroom, and the two of them stumbled onto the bed. He propped himself up and carefully looked at her, watching her fall into the charm of the love jade. He was the only one who could see her like this. He had always been the only one. Later on, he was too ruthless and she was almost in pain. Remembering that he had just recovered from his first injury, she hugged his shoulder and bit down. Cheen Anlin, rest for a while, but he seemed to have gone crazy. She couldn't resist, and there were many times when she didn't know if she was dead or alive. In the end, he pressed against her and coaxed her gently in her ear. Liang Xiao, call me Anlin. Yi Liang Xiao opened her eyes. Her usually cold eyes were tinged with passion. She looked at him, her red lips trembling, and it was indescribably seductive. Chapter 1374. After all, she didn't know much about love. How could she stand him like this? In less than half an hour, she started crying and begging him to let her go. However, the more she behaved like this, the more he found it interesting. He didn't care about anything and used all kinds of heinous methods on her. In the end, he couldn't stand it anymore. He held her and coaxed, Liang Xiao, call me Anlin and I'll let you go. She couldn't stand it anymore, so she covered her face and cried out. Her voice was as soft as a mosquito, but he heard it. The man who had said that he would let her go didn't let her go. Instead, his eyes turned red, and he let go of his hands and feet, torturing her to death. He kept asking her to call him hubby. She didn't want him to, so he went all out from morning until night fell. She called him hubby countless times until her voice was hoarse. He was only willing to let her go. Yi Liangqiu lay on the bed softly. She had no strength in her body. She looked at him with resentment in her eyes and said in a low voice, I don't want to get married anymore. She said it in a fit of pique, but he only thought it was cute. He bent down and kissed her. Be good. I'll take a bath with you. After a pause, Jun Yin showed a rare look of gratitude. I'll apply some medicine for you after the bath. Actually, he hadn't been so indulgent in a long time. Even if he had a woman in the past, he wouldn't have indulged her like this. Of course, he wouldn't say that to her. It would only make her angry. Cheen Anlin felt that he was gradually caring about her feelings. He also knew what she didn't like to hear and what she liked to hear. He was willing to make her happy. Yi Liangqiu lay on the bed. Her slender and fair body was really tempting. Cheen Anlin stood by the side and watched. His Adam's apple moved up and down. He leaned over and whispered into her ear, Liangqiu, has anyone ever told you that your body is very beautiful? She seemed to be stunned for a moment before she said softly, Yes. I used to be the male lead of a movie. Cheen Anlin felt that he had really shot himself in the foot. He didn't say anything else. He secretly thought to himself that she wasn't allowed to take on kissing scenes or bed scenes in the future. If she wanted to, she could withdraw from this circle indefinitely. He was the only one who needed to know her beauty. He picked her up, walked straight into the bathroom, and soaked in the bathtub together. Perhaps because the warm water was too comfortable, she sighed softly and lay on his shoulder, actually nibbling on him. His voice was a little low as he asked, Is your back okay? Cheen Anlin turned her face and kissed her. He kissed her affectionately for a long time. His voice was low and husky with a hint of a smile. Little Chio, if you care about me in the future, you can make it more obvious. She punched him. I don't care about you. He groaned, his expression somewhat pained. Yi Lianqiu immediately tensed up. Does your back hurt? He restrained his expression and looked at her with clear eyes. No matter how stupid she was, she knew that he did it on purpose. She snorted. You deserve to die from the pain. He held her and kissed her closely, from her eyebrows to her red lips. He whispered, how can I bear to die? My little Chio makes people want to die. She glared at him. Shameless? He laughed softly. If you want to be shameless, will you feel so comfortable? Later, they applied the ointment on one person and shared it with each other. He didn't leave her body for the whole day. Passionate love was probably like this. Chapter 1375. Yi Lianqiu was wearing a white bathrobe. She leaned against the headboard and stared at him. You did it. Qin Amlin pushed the trolley to the sofa in front of the French window. He raised his eyebrows. Do you think I only know how to make love once? Qin Amlin, can you be more shameless? She got off the bed. When she stepped on the carpet, her legs shrank. He looked at her. His eyes were clear, and he seemed to be smiling. She was a little annoyed. She glared at him. It's all your fault. Yes, it's all my fault. He walked over, picked her up, and gently placed her on the sofa. Leaning forward, he placed his hands on both sides of the sofa and looked at her. Lianqiu, you're getting better at acting coquettishly. That's good. She glared at him with a fierce look in her eyes. Qin Amlin smiled and pinched her face. Try this red wine steak. She didn't have the energy to argue with him. Besides, she was really hungry after being tortured by him for the whole day. The food he made was surprisingly delicious. She couldn't stop after eating 2 mouthfuls. After finishing the steak, she looked at the food on his plate. Qin Amlin moved a salad in front of her. Will you dislike me if I put on weight? She was actually self-disciplined. She glanced at him. Qin Amlin took a sip of iced lemonade and smiled faintly. I thought that after marriage, most of the emotional connection would still be in bed, and maintaining one's figure is a form of respect for each other. It's to allow the other party to maintain an appropriate amount of freshness and persistence. Yi Lianqiu couldn't take it anymore. She looked at him and said, why don't you talk about mating? I'm not surprised. You mean we've been mating just now, or the whole day? He raised his eyebrows. Lianqiu, I didn't expect you to have such a hardcore taste. Qin Amlin, you're a bitch, do you know that? She wiped her lips after eating, looking disgusted. He smiled. I'm only bitch to you. Although she would be angry, he still said, Lianqiu, I've been with Chi-Chi for 2 years, and I've never forced her. She doesn't have me in her heart. Although I feel sad, I can accept it. But it's different for you. Even if you like Lin Xingyuan, even if you don't want to have a relationship with me, I think I will still use force on you. As he spoke, he smiled faintly. My love for you is unscrupulous. This was probably his most direct confession, and also an indirect way to whitewash his previous self. Yi Lianqiu was stunned. After a long time, he pinched her face. Are you scared? No. She just never thought that one day Qin Amlin would have such strong feelings. Perhaps she didn't want to admit it and didn't dare to believe that he really liked her, because he had been disappointed for too long. Qin Amlin smiled. He walked over and picked her up, placing her on his lap. Together, they looked out into the dark night. His voice was low and husky. Lianqiu, look at the night. You haven't seen it for a long time, right? She didn't say anything, but her heart softened a little. From now on, every night, I can accompany you. He pressed his face against hers. There won't be anyone else. Yi Lianqiu bit her lip and wanted to say something, but he hugged her tightly. Lianqiu, just like this, it's a promise. He lowered his head and looked at her seriously. This isn't making do. You know, I'm not a person who makes do. She looked at him in a daze for a long time before saying softly, but I'm making do with you. Making do or being serious is fine. We'll live like this for the rest of our lives." He hugged her, knowing that she had finally relented. President Qin sacrificed his physical body and a whole day's worth of stamina in exchange for a half-hearted refusal. It wasn't easy. Scattering flowers. Her eyes were wide open, and her face was squeezed into a meat bun by him. In an instant, she had turned from a cold goddess to a cute pet. "Qin and Lan." Her voice was also vague. She stared at him, but there was no threat. Qin Amlin changed his tone. "Our little piggy is angry." She struggled in his arms, and the way she struggled also made his whole body angry. She didn't know when, but his eyes darkened, and the way he looked at her also became dangerous. He let go of her hand and held her face instead, kissing her little by little. "Lianxiu, do you know that you're very cute?" Chapter 1377. "Lianxiu, I want you," he said in a husky voice as he lowered his head and kissed her lips. "I want you, Lianxiu." Her face blushed slightly. She could not move as he was hugging her. She could only kick him, and he allowed her to kick him. She did not know that his eyes were already filled with emotions as he indulged her for a while. He lowered his head and kissed her, pulling down her bathrobe firmly. When he was on top of her, he bit her earlobe and said naughtily, "I wonder what a little pig tastes like. You're perverted and shameless." Lianxiu kicked him again. This time, he used his limbs to trap her easily. There was a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You're the one who provoked me first." The tip of his nose was slightly cold as he sniffed her neck. "Nibble from here, huh?" She was completely trapped as he devoured her from head to toe. In the end, she gripped the bedsheets tightly and bit her lip. "Is it dirty?" He chuckled. "Lianxiu, do you want to try?" She did not want to try. Qin Anlin did not force her. There would be plenty of opportunities in the future anyway. Moreover, they had just gotten together, and he could not bear to let her go. Hence, he leaned close to her ear and said a few shameless words. She instantly blushed and struggled while he let out a muffled groan. However, his laughter was like a spring breeze. When she woke up again, it was already afternoon. She sat up and smelled something fragrant. A little person jumped into her arms and said softly, "Mommy, Muyin?" She reached out and stroked her son's hair. "How did you get here?" Little Muyin stayed in his mother's arms obediently and raised his head. "Daddy brought me here." As they were talking, Qin Amlin came in from outside. He was dressed simply in a pair of beige trousers and a white shirt. He did not tie it up and let it down casually. Even so, he was still insanely good-looking. "It's time for lunch." He walked over and stroked her long hair. "It's 2 in the afternoon." Only then did Lianxiu remember that they didn't wake up in the morning. She was so tired that she fell asleep. Little Mu Yun saw his parents like this and ran away with a red face. Qin Amlin turned to look at his son and smiled faintly. "This child is quite precocious." As he spoke, he leaned close to her and said in a voice that only she could hear, "Actually, it's good to leave Mu Yun with my mom. Yeah, it's best if you don't go to work." She kicked him and got out of bed to get dressed. She wasn't a girl who liked to act coquettishly. It was only on the bed, only when he loved her, that she couldn't resist. All of her aloofness disappeared. Qin Amlin looked at her back and smiled. He went out to take care of little Mu Yun. She went out and was surprised to find that it was Chinese food today. His culinary skills were unexpectedly good. It was simple and tasty. As though he knew what she was thinking, Qin Amlin's gaze fell on her face, and he smiled faintly. "After you left, there was no one to cook. I could only do it myself." She didn't believe him. "Where's Annie?" His gaze paused, and there was a hint of a smile in his eyes. It was a very gentle smile. After a long time, he said, "I often couldn't sleep at night and had nothing to do, so I got up to cook. I got used to it." Chapter 1378. At that time, he was shocked that he actually remembered every single bit of her being here. He rejected this fact. He didn't want to admit it, but he couldn't resist it in the end. Yi Lianqiu took a bite and savored it slowly. She was surprised to find that it tasted very similar to what she had made. Qin Amlin's expression was a bit subtle. He seemed a bit nervous, but he also seemed to be relieved. After a long while, he said, "Not bad, right?" She looked up at him. "It's more than not bad. It's better than you." Little Mu Yun wasn't around, so he couldn't help but tease her. He looked left and right, then said in a low voice, "Then I look forward to seeing you surpass me in bed." She almost spat out a mouthful of rice. Qin Amlin immediately handed her a glass of water and said, "Drink some to calm yourself down." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. Qin Amlin sat up straight and looked at her. "Lianqiu, if you want to get pregnant, you might have to take the initiative." Her body was a bit stiff. He knew that she wanted to get pregnant. "Also, you don't have to take vitamin C anymore. Take folic acid instead," he said casually, but it was like a bomber bombing her ears. Yi Lianqiu looked at him and couldn't come back to her senses for a long time. "I've asked the doctor." He put his hand on the back of her hand. "Taking folic acid is better for the child." He paused and said, "I won't let you suffer any more during this pregnancy." His voice was a bit hoarse. Actually, he didn't want to think about how she looked when she was pregnant, because his heart would hurt when he thought about it. But in the dead of the night, when she fell asleep, he couldn't help thinking about it when he looked at her face. At that time, he really felt sorry for her. He had suffered for her. He had suffered as much as she had suffered. Yi Lianqiu pursed her lips and couldn't say anything for a long time. "Why? You don't want to give birth?" He smiled and pinched her face. "Then I'll use the tea at night?" After a long time, she said, "I'm afraid I won't be able to wear a gown when I get married. Moreover, the early stages of pregnancy are very tiring." Before she could finish, he interrupted her. He got up and walked to her side. Without saying anything, he hugged her and pressed her face against his chest. His large palm gently caressed the back of her head. He was a little excited because she said marriage. He suppressed his emotions so that he did not lose control. The child was at home, and he didn't want to embarrass himself. "Lianqiu, I won't." His heart almost jumped out. Thump, thump, thump. He had never been so full, so excited. "I promise this time it won't happen again." Her face was squeezed out of shape by him, and it was difficult for her to breathe. However, Qin Amlin didn't feel anything. He was still affectionate. "Lianqiu, do you feel my love?" She twisted her face in his arms a few times, then gritted her teeth and said, "Qin Amlin, if you go on like this, I'll probably die." Surprised, he lowered his head and looked at her twisted face. It was really a little unexpected, but also a little cute. He rubbed it twice and let go of her. "I'm sorry. I don't hear any sincerity in your tone." She continued to eat, not realizing that she had eaten the dishes she usually didn't eat. Qin Amlin noticed, and there was a gentle smile in his eyes. "Lianqiu, I'll show my sincerity that night." "Huh? I think I'll be happier if you're more shameless." She glanced at him. "Also, I don't need your sincerity." Chapter 1379. Qin Amlin smiled and pinched her little face. "Then I need you. Aren't you going to let me eat properly?" She simply vented her anger at him. And the man who disdained women immediately lowered his head and served her food, coaxing her. "Eat more." Seeing him like this, she couldn't help but soften. She didn't say anything else and ate with all her might. He reminded her again, "Pay attention to your figure." His voice was careful, as if he was afraid that she would be angry. She looked at him with judgment in her eyes, and after a long time, she said, "Carnivore." Qin Amlin served her food again and said with a smile, "Then our little pig will eat more. It'll taste better when she gets fat." Yi Lianqiu didn't say anything and unknowingly ate a lot. He smiled and reached out to wipe her mouth. He didn't let her wash the dishes and wash the dishes himself. Yi Lianqiu looked at him and felt that he had changed. Qin Amlin smiled. Let's try on the wedding dress in the afternoon. Let's go to my mom's for dinner tonight. She wants to see you." She suddenly became nervous, and her heart was against it. She and Lady Cheen didn't really like each other. "Are you afraid of her?" Cheen Amlin washed the dishes and cleaned his hands. He walked over and sat beside her, naturally wrapping his arms around her body. He looked at her. "My mom is not easy to get along with, but we won't live together in the future." Lianxiu just treated it as a social occasion. He was very straightforward. She also looked at him. "Don't you want me to get along with her? Find a way to make her like me? As long as I like her." His fingers pinched her face. "I want her to do whatever she likes." As long as his mother didn't object, it was fine, because he was the one who would spend the rest of his life with Lianxiu, not his mother. Yi Lianxiu was a little surprised and looked at him for a long time. He smiled and played with the soft flesh on her face. "Did you find another advantage of marrying me, Mrs. Cheen?" She blushed. "I'm not Mrs. Cheen." He sighed, held her in his arms, and rested his chin on her hair. "Lianxiu, I promise you will like me more and more." It sounded shameless, but this was his promise. She seemed to understand. Her face was buried in his arms, and her heart throbbed. Indeed, she didn't trust him at first, but now she somewhat believed that if they got married, she would be marrying love. Little Mu Yin watched secretly from the side, and his little face didn't have much of an expression. He looked at his parents hugging each other, and then looked at his own hands. He didn't seem to like anything in particular. The only thing he wanted to hold in his father's arms was the little yellow bun. It was soft and fragrant. It would definitely be delicious to bite into. In the afternoon, Qin Amlin brought Yi Lianxiu and Xiao Muyin to take pictures. Unfortunately, he ran into Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi. Yi Lianxiu looked at his face and sighed. "This world is really small." He looked at her sideways. "Are you jealous?" "How could that be? Pei Chi-Chi is Mr. Tang's wife. Why should I be jealous?" she said sarcastically, but he couldn't get angry. Tang Yu was very gentlemanly. He came over and smoked a cigarette with Qin Amlin. When men were together, women were naturally together as well. Yi Lianxiu had a cold personality, but she didn't hate Pei Chi-Chi. That girl was about the same age as her, but Tang Yu had spoiled her into a 20-year-old girl. She was wearing a white t-shirt and hot pants. Her long hair was braided into a long braid. From the looks of it, it was probably done by Tang Yu. Chapter 1380. Yi Lianxiu looked at herself. Actually, Qin Amlin doted on her a lot, but was it because she was too tall? Was that why she couldn't hang on to him like Pei Chi-Chi? She wanted to laugh when she thought of that scene. Forget it, I'll just forget it. They chatted casually and did not notice that Yi Muyin was staring at Xiaoxin as if she was food. Xiaoxin retreated step by step, tears welling up in her eyes. Xiaoxin was about to be eaten up. She burst into tears. Yi Muyin looked at Xiaoxin in confusion. Why was she scared and crying? However, he quickly thought of his parents. It seemed that when his father bullied his mother, she would cry too. He asked his father about it, and his father said that she would only cry because she was happy. So now, this little yellow bun was happy? His gaze became brighter, and the little yellow bun cried even harder. So, this was how the words tears of joy came about. Yi Muyin was even more certain of his thoughts, and finally, he pressed his little heart against the wall. Xiaoxin lifted her big teary eyes and blinked at him. She was not afraid of anything since she was young, but she was extremely afraid of Yi Muyin. Yi Muyin had always thought that she liked him, and that she would only cry because she was happy. He gently touched her tear-stained face with his finger, touched the tear stains, and then put his finger in his mouth. It was salty. How could it be salty? He narrowed his eyes and pursed his lips for a while, looking at the soft little bun in front of him. Salty? He wanted to taste it to know what it tasted like. So he leaned forward and kissed the little bun's little mouth. It was rosy and tender, like a nestling. It was a little salty, but then it was a little sweet, soft, with a hint of milk. Sure enough, it was the taste of a yellow bun. Yi Muyin was still a child, so he only kissed it and licked it. It tasted so good. Xiaoxin was frightened, and her eyes widened as she looked at the little brother in front of her. Her eyes were dark and bright, and they were beautiful. Yi Miyun stared into her eyes, unwilling to look away. Just at this moment, Xiaoxin finally could not overcome the fear in her heart and bit his lips hard. Blood was coming out from the bite. After that, it became a little hard to explain. Little Mu Yun's constitution meant that the bleeding could not be stopped at once. In the end, because of the kiss, the parents of the two families were not able to take a proper photo. Instead, they went straight to the hospital. Qin Anlin, who had spent a whole day and night, had contributed 200 milliliters of blood. When he came out, his face was a little pale. Yi Liangxiu glanced at him. She knew that he had lost so much blood last week that he couldn't take it anymore. She started to speak, but his fingers tightened on hers and he growled, "He's my son." However, after little Mu Yun's bleeding stopped, he had to face a problem. Why did Xiaoxin bite his lips? Xiaoxin rested on her father's shoulder. There were still tears in her eyes. "He ate mine first." She called it self-defense. Dad taught her that. A child's words did not count. In the end, they still had to check the surveillance footage. After watching it, Qin Amlin and Yi Liangxiu were too thick-skinned to show their faces. It was their precious son who provoked her, and he even kissed and licked her. They really did not want to see this scene. Yi Liangxiu pinched his arm. "If the upper beam is not straight, the lower beam will be crooked." "Hey, she is half of your genes." He was embarrassed, but he only shouted and did not retaliate. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.